It was the early 90s. Disney was hot off the critical and commercial success of several animated features, heralding in a new era of Disney animation, an era that critics were calling the Disney Renaissance. In this era of creativity and bold ambition, Beauty and the Beast producer Don Hahn, along with directors Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise, had set out to take what they had learned from Beauty and the Beast and apply it to their next animated feature, with the stated purpose of taking animation to the next level. They wanted to further animation as an art form and push the boundaries of what an animated film could be about, at least in terms of its themes and subject matter. To accomplish this, they set their eyes on an established literary classic for adults. Whether or not they accomplished the goal that they set out to achieve, they certainly gave it their all. The result, while somewhat flawed, was still one of the most ambitious films that Disney ever produced, and also one of the most complicated to discuss. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with this video, to dive a little deeper into what I believe to be one of the Disney Renaissance's most overlooked films, the imperfect but earnestly crafted masterpiece known as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. The preparation phase for this video took longer than expected, because I decided that I was going to go back and read the entire original novel before I tackled an analysis of this film. I greatly enjoyed the experience, and while the film sometimes departs drastically from its source material, I personally think that the filmmakers take the novel very seriously, at least in terms of its subjects and themes. I wish I had more time to dig into the nuanced differences between the novel and the movie, but since this video is mainly focused on the film, I'm just going to cover the things that I believe to have impacted the story the most. If a more thorough and direct comparison between the book and the film is something that you're interested in, please let me know down in the comments below. Also, before I delve too deep into that, I want to make it clear how I view adaptations in general, so that anyone watching this without context will know why I'm saying what I am about the film. To me, I often view the source material as a completely different entity from its adaptations, and both are worthy of experiencing and enjoying separately for me, if they're good, of course. Of course, there are certainly exceptions to this rule, but in general, if the adaptation is good and doesn't purposefully seek to disrespect the source material, I can usually overlook certain narrative changes. That's why I read the original novel to prep for this very video. I wanted to make sure that I experienced both pieces of media in their entirety. As I already talked about in my video essay on Alice in Wonderland, I tend to view adaptations as companion pieces to be enjoyed alongside the source material, rather than as a replacement or something that should be viewed in isolation. I understand that this isn't how most people consume media, but it's how I consume it, and it definitely influences my opinions, so I figured it was important to state that point of view up front for context. So let's get into those changes. First, I would say that the largest and most drastic change from the source material would be the story's characterization. For example, for the sake of brevity, it seems that Disney chose to consolidate and condense the traits of the novel's more extensive roster of characters into a smaller core cast. They purposefully eliminate certain characters in their entirety, such as the poet-playwright Gringoire, and give their roles and character traits to other characters instead. While this particular decision does streamline the film, something quite necessary in adaptations, it does tend to have the unfortunate side effect of simplifying or watering down the more nuanced and complex characterizations found in the book. Whether or not this sacrifice was worth it is entirely up to the individual viewer, but I think it's worth pointing out because of its effects. For instance, even if he was one of the most terrifying, loathsome, and intense Disney villains ever created, Claude Frollo is still played as a straightforward villain in this adaptation, which is not necessarily how he's depicted in the novel. Gone is his pity for Quasimodo, his surrogate father relationship with his younger brother Jahan, who doesn't even exist in the film, his struggles with fitting into society, or even his single-minded pursuit of knowledge, as they appear in the book. The film keeps his loathsome licentiousness and even adds undertones of blatant genocide to his existing racism. But all of his other character traits have been stripped away. The film even doubles his cruelty towards Quasimodo, going so far as to have him attempt infanticide on him when he first sees him, which is actually the exact opposite of what happened when Frollo first saw Quasimodo in the book. Again, whether such an extreme take on the character of Frollo was successful in accomplishing what this film set out to do is entirely up to the individual. But I think Disney deserves credit for attempting to push the archetype of the Disney villain to its absolute limit, and making an antagonist for an animated film so repugnant and so evil that fans are still talking about his extremism to this day. Fan favorite Cruella de Vil may have wanted to make puppies into coats, but even she didn't come close to the wickedness of a character who attempts genocide on an entire ethnic group. A villain like that takes guts to pull off in a Disney movie, and that wasn't even the part that horrified most audiences about the character. Perhaps Frollo's most prominent character trait from the book, his licentious desire for Esmeralda, was kept in the finished film, much to the protest of many people who haven't read the original novel. I just want to address that outcry for a minute, because while I agree that it does seem like an odd thing for the filmmakers to keep, especially considering all the other stuff they got rid of, even down to a similar character trait in Captain Phoebus, more on that later, it's not like it was their invention either. It's a crucial part of the plot in the original novel, so if anyone has a problem with it, they should probably take it up with Victor Hugo first. Whether or not it belongs in a Disney film is another matter entirely. I do think that if Disney hadn't marketed this as a kids' film, and if people weren't obliviously taking their young children to see it, like my parents did with me, there might not have been such an uproar about it. A clear, straightforward marketing campaign that was upfront about the themes and sometimes frightening aspects of the film, at least for small children, would have mitigated the controversy quite a bit. People just like to know what they're getting into, and like it or not, most people see the word Disney and automatically think safe for the whole family, which may not always be true. If anything is even remotely outside that image, it causes controversy, unless Disney is open and upfront with that information before the film is ever released, and even before they start marketing it. Nobody outside of a few niche traditionalists complained after Disney released Pirates of the Caribbean, or the early Marvel films, which were all purposefully PG-13, because they were making it very clear in the marketing and promotion materials, and even in their branding, that these films would be more mature than other Disney fare. Because of this, parents who didn't want to take their children to see these movies didn't, and everything worked out. And let's be honest, any other Renaissance Disney film that features McDonald's toys and funny gargoyles in its marketing campaign at that time, which The Hunchback of Notre Dame did, was bound to have the accidental impression that it was just for little kids. And my parents taking little baby me to the theater is proof of that. A little bit of clarity goes a long way with these accidental controversies, and in their pursuit of that precious G rating and the sweet, sweet all-ages profit that comes with it, Disney's marketing team didn't seem to have the foresight to mitigate this one. However, on the subject of avoiding outcry, I will note that at least they had the foresight to age up Esmeralda, and specifically chose a more mature and grown-up sound for her through Demi Moore's voice. Considering the shock that the audience seemed to have about a lustful villain, I can't imagine what they would have thought if they kept Esmeralda 16 years old like she is in the novel. While there may have been different maturity standards in the 15th century when the story is set, and marriage was quite common and accepted at that age by society, in today's world, that just wouldn't fly. In fact, most audiences today would find that rather horrible, to say the very least, and some may not even know about the historical context. Thank goodness that the filmmakers at least had the good sense to foresee that problem and update the film accordingly. Speaking of Esmeralda, the film made another plot decision here that I think is worth pointing out. In the book, Esmeralda is a much more prominent character. In fact, I would probably go as far as to say that she is the center of the entire book's plot. We actually spend more time with her and her story than we do with Quasimodo's. Now, I don't think this lessening of her role was entirely intentional. After all, they cut a lot of other characters that she interacted with in the book, such as Pierre Gringoire and the Recluse. And naturally, those cuts caused certain interactions with those characters to be absent from the film as well. They also censored some of her other relationships because her interactions with Frollo were already pushing what the Disney artists could get past the brand executives, which also, unintentionally, shrinks her role in the drama that's connected with it. For instance, in the original novel, Captain Phoebus isn't really a gallant knight. In fact, he's actually a womanizer and a bit of a scoundrel. He seeks to seduce Esmeralda, lying to her about loving her alone when he's actually engaged to another woman. Phoebus is really only a side character in the original novel, at least in comparison to his film counterpart, but Disney wasn't about to have two licentious villains, no matter how small their roles were. Instead of cutting another character, they repurposed Phoebus with a lot of the good traits from other characters, and made him a traditional knight in shining armor instead. This is an old cliche, and it's a little unfortunate that Phoebus gets reduced to that. In the finished film, Frollo gets all the bad, and Phoebus gets all of the good charisma. Because of this decision, much of the original plot points involving Esmeralda and the men that she interacted with were cut, and Frollo and Phoebus each became a bit more one-dimensional as a result. The good news of the change is that Esmeralda is less of a damsel in distress, who gets buffeted about through the story as a plot device by male's desire and becomes a character with more agency and personal strength as a result. The bad news is that she gets less overall screen time, and she is no longer the main protagonist of the story. I would actually be interested to see what it would look like if Disney chose to make a live-action spin-off or something with Esmeralda as the center, considering how major her role is in the original novel. But that's just a side note. The role of protagonist now falls to Quasimodo. This change is worth highlighting for several reasons. The first is the obvious point that even though it wasn't the novel's original name, Disney wanted to make sure that their version of the story, now called The Hunchback of Notre Dame, would actually be about the Hunchback of Notre Dame. The general public might not know that the novel was originally called Our Lady of Paris, 1482, and most people still don't. The only name that most English speakers outside of France know, at least the English speakers that I'm aware of, is the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So it was fair for Disney to assume that most audiences would have certain expectations upon hearing the English version's title, mainly that the story would be about the character in the title. Because of this, from a marketing point of view, the focus on Quasimodo made total sense. The second interesting point about this increased role in the story has to do with Quasimodo's characterization in general. This film's Quasimodo is purposefully played as intelligent, kind, and favorable, which follows the filmmaker's stated intent of depicting the plight of the outcast and homing in on the novel's themes of empathy and compassion. While these themes are indeed present in the original novel, and were most likely Victor Hugo's original intent for the work, along with criticizing the historical figures of power in France and preserving architectural history, the unfortunate reality is that the book was written nearly 200 years ago, and naturally suffers from outdated cultural norms that sometimes undermine this message for the modern audience that's unaware of the context. Of course, it's a little unfair to hold a novel from the 1830s to today's standards, and I think most people understand that. But that doesn't change the fact that there are still some people who are unaware of the context and might react without knowing. Specifically, while probably not Hugo's original intent, especially given his emphasis on compassion and self-sacrifice in the book, there are some rather outdated depictions of physical disabilities, culture, and gender that unfortunately had found their way into previous adaptations in the wrong way. Now, obviously, these Disney artists wanted to respect the original novel and its intent, so in this case, the Disney artists specifically tried to understand what was at the heart of the original character, especially how cruelty of people towards his appearance, his self-sacrificial nature and compassion for Esmeralda, or anyone else that shows him kindness, his great strength, or his complicated relationship with Frollo all fit into who he is. After all, he is the only main character in the original novel that eventually comes to think of Esmeralda's needs before his own, and is willing to protect her virtue and happiness over his own desires. These elements from the novel were extrapolated and expanded, and the result was a sympathetic protagonist who kept the heart of the original character's intent, while breaking away from what might now be seen as potentially harmful stereotypes about disabilities. And it's pulled off so naturally in this film that most people who aren't familiar with the novel won't even notice that something has changed, which is definitely cause for a sigh of relief, considering how weird some of these changes can feel in other adaptations. It's clearly the filmmaker's desire to put in the effort to make these alterations work, and to not feel forced. That really appeals to me, even if it does sometimes change things that are in the book. As an aside, the only time the film feels a little off to me is when it accidentally undermines its own effort for authenticity with what seems like studio mandates to add more humor to the film. As a result, I'm not really the biggest fan of the addition of the gargoyles as characters, or their more humorous musical numbers, or their physical comedy antics for that matter. These characters aren't in the original book, and while new characters aren't always a problem for me, I feel like the tonal shift that these gargoyles create in the film can sometimes accidentally undermine the film's more serious moments. I'm not mad that they're here, but I would be interested to see what the film would look like without them. They're funny and enjoyable in their own way, but I'm not sure the movie really needed them, and it felt like an addition to please the executives who wanted a funny sidekick, because apparently every Disney movie needs a funny sidekick. I honestly wonder if some of the cut content from the novel could be added back in if these characters were removed or had less screen time. However, many people do adore these gargoyles, so perhaps I'm the one who's wrong. In my opinion, while some comedic relief may sometimes be necessary, the occasionally strange tonal shifts between broad comedy and serious drama in this film can be slightly jarring, and they are something that I'll discuss in more detail in part 2 of this essay. Now that we've discussed the individual character differences in detail, I wanted to take a moment to shift the discussion away to the themes that these characters and their stories represent. I think it's important to note that the original novel has a strong theme running through it about the societal outcasts being more compassionate, kind, and even humane than those that society accepts or praises. In the novel, those who are accepted by society, while turning up their noses and acting like they're better than everyone else, are often depicted as cruel, wicked, and even pathetically self-centered. This juxtaposition between the selfless outcasts and the selfish accepted is really at the heart of this novel, and I think that the Disney artists recognized that and made an effort to get it across in the finished film. Something else that Disney did with this story was to give it a happy ending. And although that's a far cry from the original novel, it doesn't exactly break the experience for me because of how common and expected that is for Disney. I feel like Disney has become so famous for taking dark fairy tales with horrific endings and making them into positive tales with happy endings, that to not do that with at least the film's ending would honestly be shocking for an audience, and not in a good way for the box office. Because we're dealing with a beloved classic novel for adults, this might create more problems for critics and audiences than it would with a fairy tale or a children's novel. I have to admit that, for the more skeptical viewers or diehard fans of the original novel, this might be a make it or break it decision, so just bear that in mind when attempting to watch the film. For this reason, and several others, I would highly recommend reading the original novel and forming your own opinions about the change. It's absolutely worth a read regardless. In my opinion, even with all of the changes that they made, the Disney artists still seem to have an earnest desire to take this story seriously. The novel's themes surrounding the plight of the societal outcast, the abuse of authority and religion, and the idea of fear leading to ignorant prejudice against those that are different from us all carried through into the finished film. Not only that, but the film gives them the time and attention that they deserve, and doesn't try to rush through them, which is honestly a breath of fresh air compared to the corporate box checking that adaptations like this can sometimes resemble. Whether or not this film's execution works for the audience is entirely up to the individual viewer. But it does seem to me, from what little data I can garner, that most people are satisfied with the results. For what it's worth, I personally feel like the effort that went into the execution of this film is inspiring. And although it may not always be perfect, I can at least recognize its authenticity. These artists really wanted to push the envelope for animation, and although their options may have been limited in a branded studio environment, it seems like they did everything they could to make that happen. At the very least, they put as much artistry into the film as they could muster. And regardless of what others might think, even with all of its flaws, I think the results are truly beautiful.